And that is why Death Note is overrated. Wait until the Redditors get a hold of this baby. Oh. Hi, big brother. How you guys doing there at Google? You're kind of spying on me while I was writing. That's a little creepy. Oh crap. This isn't what it looks like. These aren't books. These are just artifacts. You know, my dream growing up was to start a museum. You know, and they're just here for decoration. Nothing more. I promise you. We're not reading. We're not reading. Oh crap! I gotta get out of here. Hey everybody. This is totally not Josh here for another book review, and today, as promised, we're going to be discussing 1984, written by Eric Arthur Blair, but you probably know him better as George Orwell. Now, you might not have read 1984 yet, but you might have heard of it, mainly because it gets referenced a lot. As you can tell from this lovely edition from the Folio Society, this is not the face you want to be staring at. It honestly kind of feels like the Chinese government is staring into my soul when I look at this. Now, even though with this beautiful face that you're staring at right here, this edition from the Folio Society is very well printed. The pages are very neat. Show you a passage right here. The text is very legible, and it's very evenly spaced out. And I'll even show you a little bit of the illustration. As you can see, you thought that face on the cover was creepy? Yeah, try staring at dozens of the same face on TVs all across the city you're living in. If you watched my last video about Fahrenheit 451, you'll know in that review I made a lot of references to 1984, and there's a good reason for that. Both books feature a futuristic dystopian setting, there is a deprivation of freedom for all characters involved, and that's just the fictional stuff. In real life, both these books were heavily influential. These books were among two of the most heavily banned, censored, and legally challenged books of all time. From a legal perspective, many accuse them of being ideologically corrupt or subversive, which is kind of just a fancy way of saying that, hey, this is actually a little bit too accurate for a fictional book, and we need to get rid of it. Sort of sounds like Big Brother or The Thought Police, doesn't it? This was the last book that George Orwell finished in his lifetime. He finished writing 1984 in December of 1948, just 13 months before his death in January of 1950. Orwell decided he was going to set his book in 1984, 36 years after he finished writing the manuscript in 1948. And now, conveniently, here we sit another 36 years later after the actual 1984, and in 2020 many people are comparing this year to the Orwellian 1984. Coincidence? Well, that's for you to decide. So let's get on with it, shall we? Despite this being the last book that Orwell completed in his lifetime, this was far from the first book he ever wrote. In 1936, he began writing a memoir called The Road to Wigan Pier, where he voluntarily moved to the economically depressed northern England to investigate social conditions. In the first half of the book, Orwell describes his experience living in northern England, but in the second half, well, he kind of makes an argument for socialism, and that did not sit well with a lot of people. He began being placed under special surveillance by the Special Branch, which is sort of like the British version of the CIA, and he would remain under special surveillance for 12 whole years. Orwell then joined the Spanish Civil War, associating himself with the Workers' Party for Marxist Unification, claiming that he had come to fight fascism, only for the communist press to claim him as a fascist later on. To paraphrase, Orwell was lucky to escape the Civil War alive, and when he returned home to England, he had a whole new political ideology, and he needed to put it to paper. And that he did. As always, I'm not going to spoil anything for you. My job is to encourage you to read the book, not to actually read the book for you. Having said that, there's a lot of themes in this book that are very easy to discuss without spoiling anything for you. Personal experience, I think that a lot of authors try to convey their messages and their themes in their books subtly. That way they don't feel like they're shoving their ideals down the reader's throats. But that's not the case with Orwell. He makes it abundantly clear early on what 1984 is about. But having said that, it doesn't feel like he's shoving his ideals and his messages down your throat. Now, even though I did discuss Orwell's background as well as some major historical events that happened during his lifetime and that he was involved in, You do not have to be a history nerd or a history major or expert or anything like that to read 1984. I didn't want there to be any misunderstandings or anyone getting the wrong impression with the introduction I did at the beginning. Now, of course, having said that, you can definitely tell that some of the historical events I talked about earlier, they definitely played a role in Orwell's writing of 1984. The main antagonist of the book is an entity called Big Brother. And the thing about Big Brother is that you never really see him in physical form. He's really just sort of a face on a screen, or, in this case, a face on a book cover. And yes, that is supposedly Big Brother, or at least the face of Big Brother. I sort of compare Big Brother to Sauron from Lord of the Rings in the fact that he's a massive entity, but you never see him in a physical form. He really just shows up on the TVs all across the city and in people's homes, and you cannot turn the TV off. He always sees what you're doing. He always knows what you're thinking, courtesy of the Thought Police. And when the Big Brother and the Thought Police do show up, it's not just one single guy. It's an entire agency. And because Big Brother is a giant agency, Winston Smith, the main character, he is always looking over his shoulder. He really doesn't trust anybody. He doesn't have any friends in the beginning of the book. And honestly, can you really blame him? I mean, you can't trust anyone in this society. How can you live in this society? And one day at work, Winston notices a girl named Julia. And at first he believes she's an undercover agent or something like that sent to spy on him. But it turns out that's not the case at all. She actually shares the same ideas and the same convictions that Winston does. And in turn, they sort of have a mini revolution against Big Brother. Now, some of the slogans that Orwell creates in this book, you can definitely tell they were allegorical, but the creepiest thing is that you can still find an allegory even today in modern society, despite the fact that this book was written over 70 years ago. And I think that is truly horrifying. For example, something like Big Brother. You could easily attribute Big Brother as an allegory for something like big government or technological giants that have been caught stealing people's information and essentially kind of spying on people. Other slogans include the Thought Police. If you wanted to attribute that to something nowadays, you could attribute the Thought Police to something like cancel culture. The slogan, freedom is slavery, which is repeated in 1984 a lot. I know a few political factions, so to speak, that would love to attribute that slogan to their movements, but that'd be a little bit too obvious. And of course, something like Newspeak, which in 1984 is supposed to be the language that is attributed to Oceania, which again in 1984, Oceania is basically the United Kingdom, just renamed and rebranded by who else but Big Brother. And Newspeak basically censors language that they don't want to be spoken. Sounds an awfully lot like political correctness to me. I don't know about you guys, but I like to make a lot of connections between the fictional worlds that I read and reality, because a lot of the great authors and a lot of the classical authors like to write about books grounded in reality. And I think all that I just mentioned is what makes 1984 extremely eerie, and one of the creepiest and most horrifying books I've ever read is that a lot of the themes and the entities in this book you could easily mistake for allegories, like I said, for modern society. But then you realize that this book was written over 70 years ago. And back then, political correctness wasn't nearly as rampant, at least not in the United States. And modern sort of rebellions, at least again here in the U.S., and things like cancel culture really didn't exist back in the late 1940s when Orwell finished writing this. Yes, things like censorship have always existed, but back then it was just called censorship and wasn't disguised as political correctness like it is today. Now, I do have to make one final comparison to Fahrenheit 451. I can't help myself. In Fahrenheit 451, I mentioned there was a sort of happy, uplifting ending, that maybe there would be some hope, even though it's in a dismal setting. It's not the case in 1984. It ends very gloomy and really serves as sort of a warning by Orwell to the reader. And of course, nowadays, a lot of bigwigs, so to speak, instead of using it as a warning, they use it as a blueprint. I don't know, I kind of view this as the true horror genre, and not something like Stephen King, because when I read Stephen King, a lot of his books seem a little too unbelievable, and I have to suspend my disbelief a little too much to read about a killer clown that lives in a sewer. But when you read about something like 1984, or something maybe like Requiem for a Dream, which, by the way, we'll also be giving a review, both the book and the movie, most likely the movie, but maybe not the book. The book's a little too hard to read, anyway. But I consider these to be the true horror books that I enjoy reading, because it's fiction, but it feels so realistic and too realistic. It makes you feel uncomfortable when you're reading it, but you want to read more. I mean, for the love of God, man, there's a word in the dictionary named after Orwell, the adjective Orwellian. I feel like if you get a term in the dictionary named after you, you did something right. Maybe a little too right, but you did something that got people talking about you. Alas, I know I've rambled on too much already about this book. Final thoughts, 1984 gets an A+ from me. I highly recommend you pick up a copy of the book. Maybe from the Folio Society, maybe you just want a paperback. I have plenty of those, as you can see. Just pick it up if you don't own a copy or you haven't read the book. If you keep reading quotes online of people quoting Orwell in 1984, there's a good reason for that. And I highly recommend you read the quotes for yourself in the book, not just on Twitter or whatever. So anyway, that's that. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, see ya.